Think about the foundation of your own mind. You are taught that the very concepts of logic, reason, and scientific observation are uniquely Western inventions. You are told to revere the 17th century as a miraculous turning point in human history, an era universally celebrated as the Enlightenment. You are taught that brilliant European men in powdered wigs, giants like John Locke and René Descartes, single-handedly dragged humanity out of the Dark Ages. You are told they invented the scientific method, they invented empiricism, and most importantly, they invented the foundational concept that every human being is born as a blank slate. We are told that these European philosophers built the modern free world out of their own isolated, unmatched genius. But the actual philosophical blueprint for the modern Western mind was not written in a 17th century London salon. It was not conceptualized in the grand universities of England or France. It was written 500 years earlier by an Islamic philosopher in Moorish Spain. This is the buried record, and today we are peeling back the layers on the Enlightenment heist and how a 12th century Arabic novel secretly invented the Western mind. What follows is the story of monumental intellectual appropriation they absolutely do not want you to know. If you are the kind of person who questions the foundational myths of Western civilization, if you want to know the actual history of how the modern world learned to think, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. We dig into buried records like this every single day. Let us begin with the official timeline. The version of intellectual history you were tested on in school. The narrative of the Enlightenment is arguably the most fiercely guarded, heavily defended intellectual fortress in the Western world. It is the story the West uses to prove its inherent intellectual supremacy over the rest of the globe. The textbook tells you a story of a Europe trapped in religious dogma and superstition. For centuries, the Western mind was paralyzed by the medieval belief that human beings were born with innate, divine knowledge, implanted directly by the Church and by God. You were not allowed to question the natural world. You were simply told to accept the rigid hierarchies of kings and priests. Then, according to the standard narrative, the age of reason miraculously dawns. A few brilliant European philosophers suddenly realize that the medieval way of thinking is completely backward. The absolute climax of this intellectual revolution occurs in 1689, when the English philosopher John Locke publishes a massive, world-changing book called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. In this essay, Locke introduces a concept that completely shatters the medieval worldview. It is a concept known in Latin as Tabula Rasa, which translates to the blank slate. Locke argued that human beings are not born with innate, divine knowledge. He argued that when a baby is born, its mind is a completely blank piece of paper. Everything that human being will ever know, every concept of science, morality, and logic, must be learned entirely through physical experience, sensory perception, and empirical observation. This single idea is the absolute engine of the modern world. If we are all born as blank slates, it means we are all born fundamentally equal. It means that kings do not have a divine right to rule, because their minds are built exactly the same way as a peasant's mind. It birthed the scientific method, modern democracy, and the entire framework of secular, rational thought. The West frames this as the ultimate, undisputed triumph of European intellect. John Locke is universally crowned the father of the Enlightenment. We are taught that his conceptualization of the blank slate was a spontaneous, miraculous spark of English genius that permanently altered the trajectory of human history. But if you actually dig into the historical archives, if you look at the literary translation networks of the 17th century, and if you look at what the rest of the world was writing while Europe was actively burning heretics at the stake, that beautiful, isolated narrative of Western genius completely collapses. To find the true, original author of the blank slate, we have to travel back in time, over 500 years before John Locke ever picked up a pen. We have to completely leave the damp, oppressive intellectual climate of medieval Europe and travel to the glittering, highly advanced civilization of Islamic Spain, a region known as Al-Andalus. In the 12th century, while London and Paris were filthy, intellectually stagnant backwaters, cities like Cordoba and Granada were the epicenters of global science and philosophy. They possessed massive, state-funded libraries containing hundreds of thousands of books, paved streets, and a culture that violently encouraged the pursuit of rational, scientific knowledge. And living right in the heart of this Islamic golden age was a brilliant polymath, physician, and philosopher named Ibn Tufail. Ibn Tufail looked at the heavy philosophical debates of his time, debates about how human beings acquire knowledge, and whether reason could exist independently of religious revelation. To answer this, he decided to conduct a massive, profound thought experiment. But he did not write a dry, boring academic essay. He wrote a highly engaging, beautifully structured philosophical novel. The book was titled Hayy ibn Yaqdhan, which translates to Alive, Son of Awake. This was not just a fictional story. It was the absolute first conceptualization of empirical science and the blank slate ever written in human history. The premise of the novel is breathtakingly brilliant, and it perfectly mirrors the exact philosophy the West would claim to invent 5 centuries later. Ibn Tufail imagines a baby boy, Hayy, who is spontaneously generated, or perhaps washed ashore, on a completely isolated, uninhabited desert island somewhere in the Indian Ocean. This boy has absolutely zero human contact. He has no parents to teach him. He has no society to condition him. He has no language, no books, and absolutely no religion. He is the ultimate, perfect physical embodiment of the blank slate. Hayy is adopted and nursed by a wild doe. He grows up entirely as an animal among animals. But as he matures, his mind begins to process his environment. And what follows in the pages of this 12th century Arabic novel is a flawless, step-by-step masterclass in empirical logic and the scientific method. Ibn Tufail writes how Hayy, starting with absolutely nothing but his 5 senses, begins to systematically observe the physical world. When his mother, the doe, dies, Hayy is devastated. But instead of attributing her death to a magical spirit or a supernatural curse, he conducts an autopsy. He dissects her heart, searching for the physical, biological cause of the loss of life. He independently discovers anatomy and biology through direct, empirical observation. He observes fire and figures out how to harness it. He studies the movements of the animals, the changing of the seasons, and the physics of the natural world. He realizes that by manipulating his environment through trial and error, he can improve his life. He is literally inventing the scientific method from scratch, guided only by his own sensory experience. As Hayy grows older, his mind moves from the physical to the abstract. By purely observing the perfect mathematical orbits of the stars and planets, he deduces the laws of astronomy and physics. And finally, through pure, unadulterated logic and reason, without ever reading a holy book or speaking to a prophet, he deduces the existence of a single, unified creator of the universe. Ibn Tufail's novel was a massive, revolutionary declaration. He was proving that the human mind is naturally wired for logic. He was proving that empirical observation, not blind faith, is the ultimate pathway to truth. He was proving the absolute, undeniable power of the blank slate. He had constructed the exact philosophical architecture of the Enlightenment, and he did it in the year 1190. So, a massive, terrifying question emerges for the defenders of the Western intellectual myth. If the absolute foundational blueprint for empiricism and the blank slate was written in a 12th century Arabic novel, how did those exact same concepts suddenly become the original cornerstone of John Locke's philosophy in 17th century England? To answer that terrifying question, we have to look away from the romanticized image of the isolated European genius. We have to look at the massive, highly organized, and deliberately obscured academic translation networks of the 17th century. You were taught that the European Enlightenment was a closed loop. You were told that men like John Locke, Isaac Newton, and René Descartes sat in their ornate libraries in London and Paris, reading only the ancient Greeks and each other. The Western narrative violently insists that the intellectual awakening of the 17th century was a purely European conversation. But the buried record reveals a completely different, highly interconnected reality. 17th century Europe was absolutely obsessed with the Islamic East. The most prestigious universities in Europe, specifically Oxford and Cambridge, were not just studying Latin and Greek. They were aggressively funding massive expeditions to the Middle East. They were sending scholars to places like Aleppo, Damascus, and Cairo with one explicit mission: to buy, copy, and physically extract as many Arabic scientific and philosophical manuscripts as humanly possible. The Europeans knew that the Islamic Golden Age possessed a level of philosophical and scientific sophistication that completely dwarfed their own. And sitting directly at the center of this massive intellectual extraction operation was a man named Edward Pocock. Edward Pocock was not a minor, obscure academic. He was the absolute, undisputed titan of Arabic studies in England. He was the first Laudian professor of Arabic at Oxford University. He spent years living in the Middle East, becoming fluent in the language, and building a massive, highly curated library of Islamic texts. When Pocock returned to Oxford, he brought the intellectual wealth of the Islamic world with him. And among the hundreds of manuscripts he translated and taught to the English elite, one book stood out above all the rest. It was the 12th century Arabic novel written by Ibn Tufail. In the year 1671, Edward Pocock's son, Edward Pocock the Younger, under the strict guidance of his father, published the first Latin translation of Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. They gave it a Latin title, Philosophus Autodidactus, which translates directly to the self-taught philosopher. When this translated Arabic novel hit the printing presses of Europe, it did not just sit on a dusty academic shelf. It exploded. It became a massive, undeniable, viral bestseller across the entire continent. It was an intellectual earthquake. The European philosophers, who had been struggling for decades to break free from the dogmatic, highly controlled theology of the Catholic and Protestant churches, suddenly held in their hands the exact philosophical key they had been desperately searching for. Here was a beautifully written, highly logical story that proved, step by step, that a human being did not need a king, a priest, or an innate divine spark to understand the universe. Here was the physical blueprint for empiricism. Here was the ultimate proof of the blank slate, beautifully wrapped in the compelling narrative of a boy raised by a deer on a desert island. The European reaction was frantic. The book was immediately translated from Latin into almost every major European language. In 1672, it was translated into Dutch. In 1674, it was translated into English by a Quaker named George Keith. In 1686, another English translation was published by a theologian named George Ashwell. A few years later, another brilliant English translation would be published by Simon Ockley. It was read by the founders of the Quaker movement, who used it to justify their belief in the inner light and the equality of all men. It was read by the scientists of the newly formed Royal Society in London, who saw it as the ultimate justification for their new, experimental, observation-based science. It was discussed in the coffee houses. It was debated in the grand salons. Philosophus Autodidactus was the absolute center of the European intellectual universe in the late 17th century. So, where was John Locke while this Arabic masterpiece was going viral across his exact intellectual circles? The Western textbook wants you to believe that John Locke was completely isolated from this Islamic influence. They want you to believe that when he published his groundbreaking essay concerning human understanding in 1689, inventing the concept of the blank slate and modern empiricism, he did it entirely out of his own, original, unmatched English intellect. But the physical, academic, and geographical reality of John Locke's life destroys that myth completely. John Locke was not just casually aware of the translation of Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. He was deeply, intimately embedded in the exact Oxford academic circle that translated it. Locke was a student and later a don at Christ Church, Oxford. This was the exact same college, the exact same academic breathing room as Edward Pocock. Locke and Pocock knew each other. They walked the same halls. They shared the same libraries. Locke's own mentor and close friend, the famous scientist Robert Boyle, was a massive financial backer of Pocock's Arabic translation projects. John Locke was physically surrounded by the viral explosion of Ibn Tufail's masterpiece. He was sitting at the exact epicenter of the translation wave, and the timeline of the intellectual heist is the ultimate smoking gun. In 1686, the English translation of Hayy ibn Yaqdhan by George Ashwell is published, making the concept of the feral child, the blank slate, and empirical observation widely accessible to the English public. Just 3 years later, in 1689, John Locke publishes his essay concerning human understanding. When you place Locke's essay side by side with Ibn Tufail's 12th century novel, you are not just looking at a coincidence of vague ideas. You are looking at a direct, systematic, and highly calculated appropriation of a philosophical architecture. Locke famously argues that the human mind at birth is white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. He argues that all knowledge is founded entirely on experience. He writes that observation, either of external sensible objects or the internal operations of the mind, is the sole source of human understanding. This is not just similar to the story of Hayy. It is the exact, step-by-step philosophical conclusion that Ibn Tufail proved 500 years earlier through his thought experiment on the desert island. Locke simply took the narrative of the feral child, stripped away the deer, stripped away the island, and repackaged the raw philosophical data into dry, academic English prose. He took the brilliant, narrative-driven empiricism of the Islamic Golden Age and copyrighted it under his own name. And the theft goes even deeper than just the concept of the blank slate. Ibn Tufail's novel heavily emphasized that because Hayy started with a blank slate, he was completely free from the prejudices, the dogmas, and the corrupted traditions of human society. The novel argues that societal conditioning actually blinds human beings to the truth. This exact concept, the idea that traditional society corrupts, and that pure, unconditioned reason is the only path to truth, became the absolute foundational pillar of the European Enlightenment. It is the core argument of Locke's political philosophy. It is the engine behind the concept of natural rights and the social contract. The Western world holds up John Locke as the ultimate foundational architect of modern liberty and rational thought. His philosophy directly inspired the American founding fathers. His words are physically echoed in the Declaration of Independence. But the intellectual framework that allowed Locke to conceptualize those ideas was not born in England. It was entirely, fundamentally, Islamic. Locke took the finished, polished philosophical blueprints from the brilliant mind of an Andalusian Muslim scholar, applied them to European political debates, and completely erased the original author. He never cited Ibn Tufail. He never credited the massive intellectual debt he owed to the translation networks of Oxford. He packaged centuries of brilliant Islamic philosophical evolution, slapped an English title on it, and handed it to a European continent that was desperate for an intellectual revolution. And the European academic establishment, eager to claim the dawn of rational thought as an exclusively Western triumph, accepted it without question. They took this massively appropriated philosophical framework and built an entire ideological fortress around it. They used the Enlightenment to prove that the Western mind was inherently superior, more rational, and more logically advanced than the mystical and backward civilizations of the East. They built the modern world on a stolen foundation. But how did this massive intellectual cover-up survive for over 300 years? How did the West successfully bury the true author of the blank slate, even when the translated book was sitting right there in their own libraries? To understand how this massive intellectual cover-up survived, you have to look at the violent rewriting of the global historical narrative during the age of European empire. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as European powers began to aggressively colonize the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, they needed a powerful psychological weapon. They needed a historical narrative that justified their brutal conquests. They needed to prove to themselves, and to the people they were subjugating, that the Western mind was biologically and culturally superior. To justify the horrific violence of colonialism, the West had to construct a myth that the East was fundamentally irrational, driven entirely by religious fanaticism, mysticism, and emotional chaos. They had to claim that the concepts of logic, democracy, and empirical science were the exclusive, copyrighted property of the white European male. And that meant completely erasing the Islamic roots of the Enlightenment. If the British Empire admitted that John Locke, the absolute father of Western liberty and empiricism, had actually built his entire philosophical fortress on the intellectual architecture of a 12th century Andalusian Muslim, the entire justification for European supremacy would instantly shatter. They could not claim to be bringing the light of reason to the backward East if they were forced to admit that the East had actually taught them how to think in the first place. So, the Western academic establishment executed a massive, deliberate campaign of historical amnesia. They simply stopped teaching Hayy ibn Yaqdhan as a foundational philosophical text. They quietly removed it from the core curriculum of the universities. When Western philosophers wrote histories of human thought, they deliberately drew a straight, unbroken line from the ancient Greeks, completely skipped over the 700 years of the Islamic Golden Age, and landed directly in the lap of René Descartes and John Locke. They relegated Ibn Tufail's masterpiece to the status of an obscure, exotic, oriental fable, completely stripping it of its massive, undeniable influence on the scientific revolution, and the Age of Reason. But the West did not just steal the philosophy of the blank slate. They also stole the physical narrative of the island, and then violently corrupted it to serve their own imperial agenda. Just 30 years after John Locke published his essay, an English author named Daniel Defoe published one of the most famous novels in the history of the English language, Robinson Crusoe. The Western textbook tells you that Robinson Crusoe is a brilliant, original English invention, the very first modern novel. But if you look at the structure, it is a direct, undeniable ripoff of Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. Defoe took the exact premise of a man isolated on a remote island. But look at how the Western mind twisted the Islamic blueprint. In Ibn Tufail's original 12th century masterpiece, the island is a place of profound philosophical awakening. Hayy is a blank slate who lives in perfect harmony with nature, using empirical observation to discover the beautiful, mathematical truth of the universe and the existence of a creator. He does not seek to dominate his environment, he seeks to understand it. In Daniel Defoe's 18th century Western version, the island is just a resource to be exploited. Robinson Crusoe does not use the island to discover universal truth. He uses it to establish a mini-British empire. He immediately claims ownership of the land. He builds a fortress. He stockpiles weapons. And when he finally encounters another human being, an indigenous man, Crusoe does not engage him in a philosophical dialogue. He names him Friday, teaches him broken English, and immediately turns him into an obedient slave. This is the ultimate, sickening metaphor for the Enlightenment heist. The West took the profound, brilliant, harmony-driven empiricism of the Islamic Golden Age, stripped it of its soul, and weaponized it. They took the philosophy of the blank slate, an idea originally designed to prove the fundamental equality of all human minds, and used it to build a rigid, hierarchical world where the enlightened European had the divine right to conquer the uncivilized globe. We build massive marble statues to the fathers of the Enlightenment. We sit in university classrooms and nod along as professors praise the unique, unparalleled genius of John Locke and the British empirical tradition. We are told that the West alone crawled out of the darkness and invented rational thought. But the modern Western mind was not born in isolation. It was entirely awakened, shaped, and permanently defined by a translated Arabic story. John Locke is only considered the original architect of the blank slate because the Western world deliberately decided to stop reading his bibliography. The Enlightenment was not a spontaneous European miracle. It was a massive, highly successful intellectual heist. The West didn't invent the light of reason. They simply stole the lantern from the Islamic world, smashed the original name off the side, and then convinced the rest of the planet that they had invented fire. Everything you just heard is documented. The massive, undeniable popularity of Philosophus Autodidactus in 17th century Europe is physically recorded in the printing ledgers of Oxford and London. John Locke's intimate proximity to Edward Pocock and the Arabic translation networks is an established historical fact. The exact, step-by-step philosophical mirroring between Ibn Tufail's Feral Child and Locke's essay concerning human understanding is sitting right there on the pages. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why is the true father of the Enlightenment deliberately kept out of your textbook? If this completely shattered how you see the Age of Reason and the myth of Western philosophical supremacy, share it with someone who needs to hear this. The buried record demands the truth. Subscribe, and we will keep digging.